The blood had already begun to freeze on Katherine Sullivan's temple when the last horseman disappeared over the ridge, their laughter echoing across the December wasteland like the cries of demons. She lay face down in the snow, her fingers still clutching at nothing, her breath coming in shallow gasps that created tiny clouds of warmth in the bitter New Mexico winter of 1878. The thieves had taken everything: her father's gold, the deed to their ranch, even the locket her mother had given her before the fever took her. They had beaten her, dragged her from the stagecoach, and left her to die in the mountains between Fort Stanton and Lincoln, where the storms came down from the peaks with a fury that could strip the flesh from bones. Duncan Wade had been tracking elk for 3 days when he saw the ravens circling. His stallion, a big bay named Copper, snorted and stamped in the snow, sensing something wrong on the wind. Duncan was 26 years old, lean and weathered from years working cattle in the high country, and he knew that ravens meant death or the promise of it. He had been planning to head back to his small ranch before the next storm hit, but something pulled him toward that dark circle of birds against the gray sky. When he found her, he thought at first she was already gone. Her dark hair was matted with blood and ice, her lips blue, her hands like carved marble. But Duncan had learned from an Apache tracker years ago to check for life even when it seemed impossible. So he pulled off his glove and pressed 2 fingers against her throat, searching for the pulse. It was there, faint as a whisper, irregular and weak but beating nonetheless. Her heart was still fighting even though her body had begun to surrender to the cold. "Not today," Duncan said, his voice rough in the silence. "You are not dying today." He moved quickly, his training taking over. First, he wrapped her in his heavy coat, then his bedroll, creating layers between her frozen skin and the wind that had begun to pick up. He could see the storm coming, dark clouds rolling over the mountains like smoke. There was no time to build a proper shelter here. He had passed a lined shack about 2 miles back, an old cabin used by ranchers during roundup. It was their only chance. Duncan lifted Katherine into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt against his chest. He could feel the faint rhythm of her heartbeat through all the layers, that stubborn pulse that refused to quit. He secured her on Copper's back, then climbed up behind her, holding her against him as he turned the horse toward the lined shack. The snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes that made visibility almost impossible. But Copper knew these mountains as well as Duncan did, and the horse moved steadily through the drifts. The cabin was half buried in snow when they reached it, but the door still opened, and Duncan got Katherine inside before the full fury of the storm hit. The interior was small, just 1 room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden bunk, and a table with 2 chairs. Someone had left a supply of firewood stacked against one wall, and Duncan sent up a silent prayer of thanks as he laid Katherine on the bunk and began building a fire. His hands worked automatically, striking flint to tinder, coaxing the flames to life, adding larger pieces of wood until heat began to fill the small space. But even as warmth returned to the cabin, Katherine remained deathly still. Duncan knew that warming someone too quickly after severe cold could kill them, but he also knew that leaving her in those frozen clothes would finish what the thieves had started. He worked carefully, removing her torn dress and undergarments, averting his eyes as much as possible while checking for injuries. There were bruises on her ribs, a cut on her scalp that had stopped bleeding, scrapes on her hands and knees. Her feet were the worst, the toes white and hard. Frostbite. He had seen men lose fingers and toes to the cold, had seen gangrene set in and spread. He wrapped her in the dry blankets from his saddlebag, then filled his canteen with snow and set it near the fire to melt. For hours, Duncan sat beside the bunk, monitoring her breathing, checking her pulse, adding wood to the fire. The storm raged outside, shaking the cabin walls, but inside they were safe and warm. He spoke to her sometimes, telling her stories about his ranch, about copper, about the elk he had been tracking. He did not know if she could hear him, but he had heard that unconscious people sometimes responded to voices, that it gave them something to hold onto in the darkness. "My name is Duncan Wade," he said, dipping a cloth in the warm water and dabbing it gently on her cracked lips. "I have a ranch about 15 miles south of here, not much to speak of, just 100 acres and some cattle. I built the house myself 3 years ago after I saved enough from working for the big outfits. It gets lonely sometimes, being out there alone, but I have always figured I would rather be lonely on my own land than surrounded by people on someone else's." Catherine's eyelids fluttered and Duncan leaned closer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He lifted her head slightly and tipped a few drops of water into her mouth. She swallowed reflexively, and Duncan felt hope surge through him. That was a good sign. Her body was still fighting. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. Duncan dozed fitfully in one of the chairs, always waking at the slightest change in Catherine's breathing. He massaged her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, and was relieved when her skin began to pink up. The frostbite was not as bad as he had feared. She might keep all her toes. On the second morning, Catherine's eyes opened. They were the color of whiskey, amber, and gold, and they fixed on Duncan's face with an intensity that made him catch his breath. For a long moment, she just stared at him, confusion and fear and something else flickering across her features. Then her hand moved under the blankets, touching her body, realizing she was naked. "Easy now," Duncan said, holding up his hands. "You were freezing to death. I had to get you out of those wet clothes. I did not do anything improper, I swear on my mother's grave. Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and painful. "Where am I? My name is Duncan Wade. You are in a line shack in the mountains between Fort Stanton and Lincoln. I found you in the snow 2 days ago. You were nearly dead." Catherine closed her eyes and tears leaked from the corners, cutting tracks down her pale cheeks. "The men, they took everything. They killed the driver, killed the guard, they beat me and left me. You know who they were. 3 of them. The leader had a scar across his nose and he wore a red bandana. They knew about the gold. They knew exactly which stage coach to hit." Her voice broke. "They took the deed to my ranch. Everything my father worked for. He died 6 months ago, and I was bringing the gold to pay off the mortgage. Now it is all gone." Duncan felt anger kindle in his chest. He had heard of the gang that had been operating in Lincoln County, brutal men who killed without hesitation. A man with a scarred nose and a red bandana. That sounds like Carson Fletcher's gang. They have been hitting stages and payrolls all through the territory. "I do not care who they are," Catherine said, opening her eyes again. "They took everything and they left me to die, but I did not die." There was steel in her voice now, a determination that Duncan recognized. This was a woman who did not give up easy. "No, you did not die," Duncan agreed. "You have got a strong heart, miss. Sullivan, Katherine Sullivan." She tried to sit up, but weakness overwhelmed her and she fell back against the thin pillow. "How bad am I? You have got some bruises, a cut on your head, and your feet were frostbitten, but I think you will keep your toes. You need rest and food and time to heal." Duncan stood and went to his saddlebags, pulling out some jerky and hardtack. "It is not much, but it will give you strength." Catherine ate slowly, her hands shaking. Duncan watched her, noting the proud set of her jaw, the way she refused to show weakness even though he could see the pain in her eyes. She was beautiful, he realized, though that beauty was currently hidden under bruises and exhaustion. Her dark hair, now dry, fell in waves past her shoulders. Her face was oval-shaped with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it smiled often, though it was drawn tight with pain now. "How long until we can leave?" Katherine asked. "I need to get to Fort Stanton. I need to report what happened." Duncan walked to the small window and looked out at the snow still falling steadily. "The storm is not done yet. Could be another day or two before it is safe to travel. Even then, it will be slow going through these drifts. I cannot just sit here. Those men are getting farther away with every hour. Those men are holed up somewhere waiting out the storm, same as us," Duncan said. "And even if they were not, you are in no condition to go after them. You can barely sit up." Katherine's jaw tightened, but she knew he was right. She looked down at her hands, at the bruises on her wrists where the thieves had grabbed her. "Why did you help me? You could have left me there. Most men would have." Duncan turned from the window and met her eyes. "My mother always said that a man's character is measured by what he does when no one is watching. Besides, when I felt your heartbeat, still fighting against all odds, I knew you were not meant to die on that mountain. Some things you just know in your gut." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that needed no words. Katherine saw in Duncan's eyes a kindness that had become rare in her world, a decency that reminded her of her father. Duncan saw in Katherine's gaze a strength and courage that stirred something in his chest, something he had not felt in a long time. The storm finally broke on the third day. Duncan went outside to check on Copper and dig a path from the cabin door. The world was transformed, everything buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, the mountains gleaming white under a clear blue sky. It was beautiful and deadly, the kind of beauty that killed people who did not respect it. Inside, Katherine had managed to get dressed in her torn and mended clothes. Duncan had done his best to clean and repair them, though they were still in poor shape. She stood when he came back in, testing her legs, and though she swayed, she stayed upright. "We need to talk about what comes next," Duncan said. "Fort Stanton is about 20 miles from here, but with the snow, it will take us the better part of 2 days to get there. My ranch is closer, about 15 miles south. We could go there first, get you properly recovered, get you some decent clothes." "I appreciate the offer, but I need to report the robbery. The law needs to know about Fletcher and his gang. The law in Lincoln County is Sheriff William Brady, and everyone knows he is in the pocket of the big ranchers. He will write up a report and file it away and do nothing." Duncan hesitated, then continued. "I am not trying to tell you what to do, but going to Fort Stanton half frozen in torn clothes, weak and injured, that is not going to help you get justice. Come to my ranch first. Get your strength back. Then we can figure out the best way to go after Fletcher." Katherine wanted to argue, but exhaustion washed over her. Duncan was right. She could barely stand, let alone ride 20 miles through snow, and something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, made her trust him. "All right, your ranch first. But then I am going after Fletcher, with or without the law's help." "I would expect nothing less," Duncan said, and there was the hint of admiration in his tone. They set out an hour later, Katherine riding in front of Duncan on Copper, his arms around her to keep her steady. The horse moved carefully through the deep snow, and Duncan guided them along ridgelines where the wind had scoured away some of the drifts. The sun was bright, reflecting off the snow with an intensity that made them squint, and the cold air burned their lungs with each breath. Katherine leaned back against Duncan's chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her back. She had always been independent, had always taken care of herself since her mother died when she was 12. Her father had raised her to be strong, to shoot straight and ride hard and never back down from a challenge. But right now, wrapped in Duncan's arms as they crossed the frozen wilderness, she allowed herself to accept help, to take comfort in another person's strength. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, partly to stay awake, partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "It is nothing fancy," Duncan said. "Two-room cabin, barn, corral. I have got about 50 head of cattle and a few horses. The land is good, with a creek that runs year-round and plenty of graze. I have been building it up slowly, adding to the herd, improving the buildings. I always figured I would need a bigger place someday if I ever found a woman who could stand living out there with me. Why have you not?" Duncan was quiet for a moment. "I guess I have not met the right woman. Most of the women around Fort Stanton want a man with money and prospects, not a struggling rancher who spends most of his time chasing cattle in the mountains." "Then they are fools," Katherine said softly. "A good man is worth more than all the money in the world." Duncan's arms tightened slightly around her, and Katherine felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the blankets wrapped around her shoulders. They reached Duncan's ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink. The cabin was built of logs, solid and well-made, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. The barn was smaller but equally well constructed, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone had been keeping the fire going. A boy of about 16 came running from the barn, his face breaking into a smile when he saw Duncan. "Mr. Wade, I was getting worried. This storm was a bad one." "I am fine, Tommy. Had some business in the mountains." Duncan dismounted and helped Katherine down, catching her when her legs buckled. "This is Miss Sullivan. She needs a place to stay for a while. Can you take care of Copper for me?" Tommy's eyes widened when he saw Katherine's bruised face and torn clothes, but he was smart enough not to ask questions. "Yes, sir. I will rub him down good and give him extra oats." He led the horse toward the barn, glancing back over his shoulder with open curiosity. "Tommy helps me with the ranch," Duncan explained as he guided Katherine toward the cabin. "His father was killed by rustlers 2 years ago, and his mother could not manage their place alone. They sold out and moved to Fort Stanton, but Tommy wanted to stay and work. He is a good hand, learns quick." Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly neat. The main room had a fireplace with a carved mantel, a table with 4 chairs, a settee that had seen better days, and shelves lined with books. Katherine noticed the books with surprise. Not many cowboys she knew were readers. Through a doorway, she could see a bedroom with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. "You can have the bedroom," Duncan said. "I will sleep out here on the settee. I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will. You need proper rest." Duncan's tone left no room for argument. He guided her to the bedroom and helped her sit on the bed. "I will heat some water so you can wash up, and I will see if I can find something better for you to wear. I have got a couple of old shirts that might work until we can get you some proper clothes." Katherine caught his hand before he could leave. "Duncan, thank you for everything. You saved my life." Duncan looked down at her hand on his, small and pale against his sun-darkened skin. "I just did what anyone should do, but most people would not have." "You are a rare kind of man, Duncan Wade." Their eyes met, and something sparked between them, a connection that made Duncan's breath catch. He gently squeezed her hand, then pulled away, suddenly nervous. "I will get that water heating." Over the next week, Katherine slowly regained her strength. Duncan was attentive but never intrusive, bringing her meals, checking her injuries, making sure she had everything she needed. Tommy, once he got over his shyness, proved to be good company, telling her stories about the ranch and the territory while Duncan worked outside. Katherine learned that Duncan had come to New Mexico from Texas 5 years ago, looking for land of his own. He had worked for various ranches, saving every penny, learning the country and the business. He had bought this land 3 years ago and had been building it up ever since. He was well respected in Fort Stanton, known as honest and hardworking, a man who kept his word. "Mr. Wade is the best man I know," Tommy said one afternoon as he brought Katherine a cup of coffee. "When my pa died, there were a lot of men who could have helped my ma, but most just made offers on our land for pennies on the dollar, trying to take advantage. Mr. Wade offered fair price, and when my ma could not take it, he hired me on and gave me a place to stay. He did not have to do that." Katherine watched through the window as Duncan worked with a young horse in the corral, patient and steady, his movements economical and sure. She found herself watching him often, drawn to the quiet strength he exuded, the kindness in his eyes, the way he treated everything and everyone with respect. She also found herself thinking about her ranch, the land her father had carved from the wilderness 30 miles north of Fort Stanton. Without the deed, she had no legal claim to it. The bank would foreclose and everything would be lost. The thought made her sick with grief and anger. Her father had worked himself into an early grave to build that ranch, and she had promised him she would keep it going. Now it was gone, stolen by men who thought nothing of murder and violence. On the 8th day, Katherine felt strong enough to venture outside. Duncan had found some old clothes that had belonged to Tommy's mother, and though they were too big, they were better than her ruined dress. She wrapped herself in a coat Duncan had lent her and walked to the corral where he was working with the young horse. "He is beautiful," Katherine said, watching the colt move around the corral, all long legs and nervous energy. "He will be, once he settles down and learns some manners," Duncan said. He opened the gate and stepped out, latching it behind him. "You should not be out in the cold yet." "I am tired of being inside. I need to start moving, start getting my strength back." Katherine leaned against the fence, her eyes on the mountains in the distance. "I need to start figuring out how to get my ranch back." Duncan leaned beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I have been thinking about that. The deed was registered in Fort Stanton, right? So there will be a record of it. Even if Fletcher has the physical deed, you can prove ownership through the county records. But without the gold, I cannot pay the mortgage. The bank will foreclose regardless." "How much was the mortgage?" Katherine hesitated, then said, $1,500. Duncan let out a low whistle. "That is a lot of money. My father borrowed against the ranch to buy breeding stock 3 years ago. He was paying it back slowly, but then he got sick and the medical bills ate up everything. When he died, the bank gave me 6 months to pay it off or lose the ranch." Katherine's voice was bitter. "I sold everything that was not nailed down, every cow, every horse except what I needed to work the place. The gold I was carrying was everything I had, and it still was not enough. I was going to ask the bank for an extension, try to negotiate. Now I have nothing to negotiate with." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Then Duncan said, "I have some money saved, not $1,500, but some. Maybe we could work out a partnership, combine our operations. Your ranch and mine together, we would have enough land and water to run a good-sized herd." Katherine turned to look at him, startled. "Duncan, I cannot ask you to risk your savings on my problem." "You are not asking, I am offering." He met her eyes steadily. "Besides, it makes good business sense. Pooling resources, combining herds, and it would give us more leverage against the big ranches that are trying to push out the smaller operators. Or it could lose you everything if the bank will not deal." "That is a risk," Duncan admitted, "but I have learned that nothing worth having comes without risk." His gaze was intense, and Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were not just talking about ranches and business anymore. "Why are you doing this?" Katherine asked softly. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Duncan reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Because when I found you in that snow, fighting to live against all odds, something changed in me. I have been alone for a long time, Katherine, building my ranch, working toward a future I could not quite see. But when I carried you down that mountain, when I sat beside you wondering if you would live or die, I realized that all the land and cattle in the world do not mean much if you have no one to share it with." Katherine's breath caught. She had known on some level that feelings were developing between them, but hearing Duncan speak them aloud made them real, immediate, and slightly terrifying. "Duncan, we barely know each other." "I know enough," he said. "I know you are strong and brave. I know you fight for what you love. I know that in the week you have been here, this cabin has felt more like a home than it ever has before." He took her hand, holding it gently. "I am not asking for promises or commitments. I am just asking you to stay to let me help you to see where this might go." Katherine looked at their joined hands, feeling the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. Every instinct told her she could trust this man, that what he offered was real and worth reaching for. "All right," she said. "All right, let us see where this goes." Duncan smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face, and Katherine felt her heart skip. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her softly. It was gentle and sweet, a promise of possibilities, and when they parted, Katherine found herself smiling too. "We should go to Fort Stanton tomorrow," Duncan said, still holding her hand. "Talk to the land office about your deed, see what the situation is with the bank. And I want to ask around about Fletcher. Someone must know where he and his gang are holing up." Katherine nodded, but a shadow crossed her face. "Duncan, Fletcher and his gang are dangerous men. They kill without hesitation. I do not want you getting hurt because of me. They hurt you and stole from you. That makes it my business now." There was steel in Duncan's voice, a hardness that Katherine had not heard before. "Besides, men like Fletcher need to be stopped. If we do not stand up to them, they will just keep hurting people." They rode to Fort Stanton the next morning, both of them on copper since Katherine's horse had been taken by the thieves. The town was bustling with soldiers from the nearby fort, ranchers bringing in supplies, and families doing their winter shopping. The land office was a small building near the center of town, run by a clerk named Hiram Walsh, who had been registering deeds in Lincoln County for 20 years. Walsh remembered Katherine's father and expressed sympathy at his passing. When Katherine explained about the robbery and the stolen deed, Walsh nodded gravely. "I heard about that stage robbery. Bad business. But you are in luck, Miss Sullivan. We keep copies of all registered deeds. I can make you a certified copy for a small fee. It will be just as legal as the original." Relief flooded through Katherine. At least she would not lose the ranch to fraud. The mortgage was still a problem, but having legal proof of ownership was a crucial first step. Next, they visited the bank. The manager, a portly man named Silas Hutchins, was less sympathetic. "I understand your predicament, Miss Sullivan, but the bank has obligations too. The mortgage was due last month. We have already extended you considerable latitude." "I had the money," Katherine said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I was bringing it to you when I was robbed." "Surely that counts for something." Hutchins spread his hands. "What am I to do? The money is gone. You have no way to pay. The bank must foreclose." Duncan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "What if Miss Sullivan had a partner? Someone who could help make payments while the ranch gets back on its feet?" Hutchins looked at Duncan with interest. "You are talking about yourself, Mr. Wade." "I am. I am proposing a partnership. My ranch and Miss Sullivan's combined operations. We would have enough resources to make regular payments while building up the herd. You would get your money and we would keep both ranches operating. How much can you put down today? $300. Hutchins calculated mentally. That would show good faith. But I would need to see a formal partnership agreement, and I would want monthly payments of $50 starting next month. Duncan glanced at Katherine, who nodded slightly. We can do that. Then come back tomorrow with the partnership papers drawn up, and we will discuss new terms. Hutchins stood, indicating the meeting was over. I am glad to see you recovering, Miss Sullivan. That was a terrible ordeal you went through. Outside, Katherine let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. $300, Duncan. That is a lot of money. It is what I have saved, and it is worth it if it keeps your ranch in your hands. Duncan took her elbow, guiding her down the wooden sidewalk. Now we need to find a lawyer to draw up those partnership papers, and then I want to talk to the sheriff for all the good that will do. Sheriff William Brady was exactly as Duncan had described, a politician first and a lawman second. He listened to Katherine's account of the robbery with apparent sympathy, but his response was predictable. I will put out the word about Fletcher, but the truth is he could be anywhere by now. Mexico, Texas, Arizona. Without witnesses or evidence, there is not much I can do. What about tracking them? Katherine demanded. The snow will have preserved their trail. In this weather, even if we found their trail, they have got a week's head start. My deputies and I are not equipped for a long pursuit in these conditions. Brady stood, making it clear the conversation was over. I will file your report, Miss Sullivan. If we hear anything about Fletcher, I will let you know. On the street, Katherine clenched her fists in frustration. He is not going to do anything. Fletcher is going to get away with murder and robbery. Not if I can help it, said a voice behind them. They turned to find a tall man with dark skin and gray streaked hair watching them. He wore the clothes of a rancher, but there was something about his bearing that suggested military training. Name is Samuel Wright. I could not help overhearing your conversation with the sheriff. You were listening at the door. Duncan's voice was cool. I was waiting to see Brady about some rustling on my spread, but when I heard Miss Sullivan talking about Fletcher, I paid attention. Wright stepped closer, lowering his voice. Fletcher and his gang hit my payroll wagon 6 months ago, killed 2 of my men. Brady did nothing then either. Do you know where Fletcher is? Katherine asked. I have heard rumors. There is an old mining camp up in the Capitan Mountains, abandoned for years. Some of the Mexican families who live in the area say they have seen smoke from up there, riders coming and going at odd hours. Could be nothing, could be Fletcher's hideout. Duncan considered this. The Capitan Mountains are rough country, especially in winter. If Fletcher is up there, he is well protected. Which is why he chose it, Wright said. But if someone were to go up there, maybe scout it out, they might be able to prove Fletcher is there and force Brady's hand. Or they might decide to handle things themselves. Why are you telling us this? Katherine asked. Wright's expression darkened. Because one of the men Fletcher killed was my foreman. He had a wife and 3 kids. I want Fletcher to pay, and I do not much care whether it is legal justice or the other kind. He tipped his hat. Good luck, Miss Sullivan. You need anything, my ranch is 10 miles west of town. Anyone can point the way. He walked away, leaving them on the sidewalk. You trust him? Katherine asked. Duncan watched Wright disappear into the crowd. I think he is telling the truth about Fletcher. Whether we should go after him ourselves is another question. They spent the rest of the day making arrangements. A lawyer drew up partnership papers combining their ranches into a single operation, with equal ownership between Duncan and Katherine. The bank accepted their terms, though Hutchins made it clear he would foreclose immediately if they missed a payment. By the time they started back to Duncan's ranch, it was late afternoon and both were exhausted. That night, as they ate dinner at Duncan's table with Tommy chattering about the day's work, Katherine felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. The last months had been so hard, watching her father die, struggling to keep the ranch going alone, making the desperate journey to Fort Stanton with all her remaining money. The robbery had seemed like the final blow, the end of everything. But now, sitting in this warm cabin with Duncan across from her and a partnership agreement that gave her a chance to keep her father's dream alive, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would work out. After Tommy went to the bunkhouse he shared with the other seasonal hands, Duncan and Katherine sat by the fire. The firelight played across Duncan's features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes. Katherine found herself watching him, noticing little things. The way his hands moved as he whittled a piece of wood, the concentration on his face, the gentleness in his touch when he handed her a cup of coffee. "What are you thinking about?" Duncan asked, catching her looking at him. "About how much has changed in 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago I was alone and desperate. Now I have a partner, a chance to save my ranch, and—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. "And," Duncan prompted, a smile playing at his lips, "and maybe something else. Something I did not expect to find." Katherine set down her coffee cup and moved to sit beside him on the settee. "When I married my first husband, I was 18 and stupid. He was handsome and charming, and I thought I was in love. It lasted 6 months before he ran off with a saloon girl and all the money from my father's safe. After that, I swore I would never trust another man with my heart. But you are reconsidering." Duncan set aside his whittling and turned to face her fully. "You make it hard to keep that promise. Every day you do something that makes me trust you more, that makes me—" She hesitated, then said in a rush, "That makes me fall for you." Duncan reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I am falling for you too, Katherine. Maybe I have been since the moment I found you in that snow, since I felt your heartbeat refusing to quit. You are like no woman I have ever met, strong and brave and beautiful, and being around you makes me want to be a better man." Katherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. When Duncan kissed her this time, it was deeper, more passionate, a kiss that spoke of longing and need and the promise of more to come. Katherine wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against hers. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Duncan rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to stay, Katherine, not just until we figure things out with the ranch. I want you to stay because this is where you belong with me." "I want that too," Katherine whispered. "I want that so much it scares me." "Then do not be scared. We will figure it out together." They sat by the fire late into the night, talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Duncan spoke of his desire to build a ranch that would last generations, a legacy to leave behind. Katherine talked about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, about her determination to honor his memory by keeping the ranch going. They discovered they shared a love of reading, a passion for the land, and a belief that hard work and integrity mattered more than money or status. When Katherine finally went to bed, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling, the wind outside, the faint crackle of the dying fire. She thought about Duncan sleeping on the settee in the next room, about the way he had kissed her, about the feelings growing stronger every day. She had not expected this, had not planned for it, but sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. The next morning, Duncan announced his intention to scout the Capitan Mountains. "If Fletcher is up there, we need to know." And if we have solid proof of his location, maybe we can convince Brady to do something, or at least get a federal marshal involved. I am coming with you, Katherine said immediately. It is too dangerous. It is my fight more than yours. Fletcher and his gang robbed me, beat me, left me to die. I have a right to face them. Duncan started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes and sighed. You are not going to back down on this, are you? Not a chance. Then we do it smart. We scout only, no confrontations. We find out if Fletcher is there, gather information, and then we decide our next move. Duncan looked at her seriously. I am not losing you again, Katherine. I just found you. They set out 2 days later after Duncan had made arrangements for Tommy to watch the ranch. They packed carefully, bringing warm clothes, plenty of ammunition, and supplies for several days. The ride into the Capitan Mountains took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country Katherine had ever seen. Snow-covered peaks towered above them, and frozen waterfalls hung like crystal sculptures from cliff faces. The beauty was breathtaking and deadly. They found the old mining camp on the 3rd day. It was tucked into a canyon, almost invisible from below, accessible only by a narrow trail that would be easy to defend. Smoke rose from one of the buildings, and they could see horses in a makeshift corral. Through Duncan's spyglass, Katherine counted at least 5 men, including one who matched the description of Carson Fletcher. That is him, she said, her voice tight with anger. The one with the scar and the red bandana. Duncan watched for a while longer, noting the layout of the camp, the routines of the guards. They are set up well. No way to approach without being seen. If we try to take them ourselves, we will likely get killed. So what do? We get help. Duncan lowered the spyglass. Samuel Wright said he wanted Fletcher to pay. Let us see if he meant it. They rode back to Fort Stanton and found Wright at his ranch, a sprawling operation with hundreds of head of cattle. Wright listened to their report with growing interest. You are sure it is Fletcher? I saw him myself, Katherine said. And 2 of the other men from the robbery. Wright nodded slowly. Then we need to move quickly before they relocate. I can muster 15 men, all good with guns and loyal. Brady will not help, but maybe if we present him with Fletcher in custody, he will have no choice but to prosecute. Or we could contact the federal marshal in Santa Fe, Duncan suggested. This is a federal crime, robbing the mail stage. That gives the marshal jurisdiction. That will take weeks, Wright objected. Fletcher could be gone by then. They argued back and forth, finally settling on a compromise. Wright would send a rider to Santa Fe to inform the marshal, while they kept watch on Fletcher's camp to make sure the gang did not slip away. If Fletcher tried to leave before the marshal arrived, they would move to stop him. Over the next week, Duncan and Wright's men took turns watching the mining camp. Katherine insisted on taking her share of the surveillance, and though Duncan did not like it, he recognized her right to be involved. They learned Fletcher's routines, identified all 7 members of his gang, and documented their movements. Wright's rider returned with news that the marshal was assembling a posse and would arrive within 10 days. But on the 9th day, everything went wrong. Katherine was on watch with 2 of Wright's men when Fletcher and his gang suddenly began packing up. They moved quickly and efficiently, clearly preparing to abandon the camp. One of Wright's men rode hard back to the ranch to alert Duncan and Wright, while Katherine and the other man kept watch. By the time Duncan arrived with Wright and 15 armed men, Fletcher's gang was mounted and ready to ride out. Duncan made a quick decision. We cannot let them leave. Once they scatter, we will never find them again. He turned to Wright. We go in fast and hard. Try to take them alive if possible, but do not take unnecessary risks. These men are killers. They moved down the trail toward the mining camp, spreading out to cover multiple approaches. Katherine rode beside Duncan, her rifle ready, her heart pounding. She knew this was dangerous, knew people might die, but she also knew that letting Fletcher escape was not an option. Fletcher's men saw them coming when they were still 50 yards out. There was a moment of frozen tableau, both sides staring at each other, and then Fletcher grabbed for his gun. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Duncan pulled Katherine from her horse and behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. The air filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of powder. Men shouted, horses screamed, and the thunder of guns echoed off the canyon walls. The fight was short but brutal. Fletcher's men were outnumbered and caught in the open. 3 of them threw down their guns and surrendered immediately. 2 others tried to fight their way out and were shot from their horses. Fletcher himself made a run for it, spurring his horse up a side trail, but Wright cut him off. There was a brief exchange of gunfire, and then Fletcher's horse went down, throwing him hard against the rocks. When the smoke cleared, Fletcher lay bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, his gun 10 feet away. Wright stood over him, his own gun trained on Fletcher's head. Duncan and Katherine ran over along with several of Wright's men. Fletcher looked up at them through pain-glazed eyes, and recognition flashed across his face when he saw Katherine. You were supposed to be dead." "You tried," Katherine said coldly. "You failed." Sheriff Brady was furious when they brought Fletcher and his surviving gang members to Fort Stanton. But with the federal marshal due to arrive any day and witnesses from Wright's ranch willing to testify, he had no choice but to lock them up. The stolen gold was found in Fletcher's saddlebags, along with the deed to Katherine's ranch. When the marshal arrived 3 days later, he took custody of the prisoners and assured Katherine that Fletcher would hang for his crimes. The trial took place 6 weeks later in Santa Fe. Katherine testified about the robbery, the murder of the stage driver and guard, and how Fletcher had left her to die. Duncan testified about finding her and about the evidence they had gathered. Wright and his men testified about the shootout at the mining camp. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Fletcher was hanged 2 days later. Katherine did not attend the execution, but she felt a weight lift from her shoulders when Duncan brought her the news. Justice had been served, and the men who had tried to kill her would never hurt anyone again. With the gold recovered, Katherine was able to pay off the mortgage on her ranch. True to their partnership agreement, she and Duncan combined their operations, running cattle on both properties. It made practical sense. Together, they had more land, more water, and more leverage. But both knew the partnership was about more than business. Spring came to New Mexico in a riot of wildflowers and green grass. The snow melted from the mountains, the creeks ran high and cold, and the cattle grew fat on new growth. Duncan and Katherine worked side by side, mending fences, branding calves, building corrals. Tommy proved invaluable, and they hired 2 more hands to help with the growing operation. As the days grew longer and warmer, the relationship between Duncan and Katherine deepened. They courted properly, with Duncan riding to Katherine's ranch to take her on picnics, bringing her flowers, treating her with the respect and tenderness she deserved. Katherine found herself falling more in love with him every day, charmed by his quiet strength, his gentle humor, the way he treated her as an equal partner in every way. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch of Katherine's ranch house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Duncan took her hand. "Katherine, I have been thinking about our partnership." "Oh," Katherine's heart began to beat faster. She had been hoping for this conversation, dreaming about it, but she was still nervous. "We have been partners in business for 4 months now, and I hope, we have been becoming partners in other ways too." Duncan turned to face her, his eyes serious. "I love you, Katherine. I think I have loved you since the moment I found you fighting for life in that snow. You are everything I could ever want in a woman. Strong, brave, smart, beautiful. You make me want to be a better man. You make every day brighter just by being in it." Tears filled Katherine's eyes. "Duncan." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know you have been hurt before. I know you have reasons not to trust easily. But I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that I will spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me. I will never leave you, never betray you, never give you reason to doubt my love." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "Katherine Sullivan, will you marry me? Will you be my partner not just in business but in life?" Katherine looked at the ring, at Duncan's hopeful face, at the life they had been building together. She thought about her father, about how proud he would be that she had saved the ranch. She thought about her disastrous first marriage, about the walls she had built around her heart. And she thought about Duncan, about his kindness and strength, about how he had refused to let her die that day in the snow, about how he had stood beside her through everything since. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Duncan Wade." Duncan's face lit up with joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling through tears. They were married a month later in the small church in Fort Stanton. Samuel Wright stood up for Duncan, and Tommy beamed proudly from the front row. Half the town turned out, ranchers and their families, shopkeepers, even Sheriff Brady, who seemed to have developed selective memory about his lack of help with Fletcher. Katherine wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Duncan wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his boots polished to a shine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Duncan kissed Katherine as if they were the only two people in the world. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Katherine felt happiness so intense it was almost painful. She had not thought, lying in that snow waiting to die, that she would ever feel this way again. But Duncan had saved her life in more ways than one, and she would spend the rest of her days being grateful for the stubborn cowboy who had refused to let her heartbeat stop. The reception was held at Wright's ranch, with tables groaning under the weight of food, musicians playing lively tunes, and dancing that lasted long into the night. Katherine danced with Duncan, with Wright, with Tommy, and with what seemed like every man in Lincoln County. But her eyes always returned to Duncan, to her husband, and the look he gave her in return made her blood warm. When they finally returned to Duncan's ranch, which was now their ranch, Duncan carried Katherine over the threshold despite her laughing protests. He set her down gently in the bedroom, and for a moment they just looked at each other, both suddenly shy. "I love you," Duncan said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Katherine whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for finding my heartbeat when I thought everything was lost." "I will always find you," Duncan promised. "No matter what happens, no matter how dark things get, I will always find you." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a celebration of love and trust and the future they would build together. When Katherine fell asleep in Duncan's arms, she dreamed not of snow and thieves and death, but of green grass and healthy cattle and children laughing in the sunshine. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but filled with joy. They combined the two ranch houses, spending summers at Katherine's place in the high country where the grass was better, and winters at Duncan's ranch closer to Fort Stanton. The cattle operation thrived, and by fall they had doubled the size of their herd. They hired 3 more permanent hands and built a larger bunkhouse to accommodate them. In the spring of 1880, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. Duncan was overjoyed, though he immediately became overprotective, trying to prevent Katherine from doing any heavy work. Katherine, practical as always, ignored most of his concerns and continued working alongside him until her belly grew too large to mount a horse easily. Their son was born in November, a healthy boy with Duncan's dark hair and Katherine's amber eyes. They named him James Daniel Wade, after both their fathers. Duncan held his son with such tenderness and awe that Katherine fell in love with him all over again. Watching her strong cowboy husband cradle their tiny baby, singing lullabies in his rough voice, she knew she had found the happiness she had always dreamed of but never dared hope for. As James grew, the ranch continued to prosper. They bought additional land, increased their herd to over 500 head, and became one of the most successful operations in Lincoln County. Duncan's reputation for honesty and fair dealing attracted good men to work for them, and Katherine's sharp business sense ensured they made smart decisions about breeding stock and market timing. In 1882, Katherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret. She had Katherine's dark hair and Duncan's steady temperament, and from the moment she could walk, she followed her father everywhere, determined to be a rancher like her parents. The children grew up strong and healthy, learning to ride before they could raid, helping with chores as soon as they were able. James inherited his mother's fierce determination and his father's quiet strength. Sarah was bold and curious, always getting into mischief but charming her way out of trouble with her father's easy smile. In 1885, another son joined the family. They named him Thomas, after Tommy, who had become like family to them over the years. Tommy had married a girl from Fort Stanton and built his own small ranch with help from Duncan and Katherine, but he remained their closest friend and most trusted hand. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle diseases and market crashes. But through it all, Duncan and Katherine stood together, partners in every sense of the word. When times were tough, they tightened their belts and worked harder. When times were good, they saved for the inevitable downturns and reinvested in the ranch. As the children grew older, James showed a talent for working with horses, breeding and training them with a skill that rivaled his father's. Sarah developed a head for numbers and began keeping the ranch books, catching accounting errors and finding ways to improve their profits. Thomas, the youngest, had his father's adventurous spirit and talked endlessly about becoming a lawman when he grew up. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Duncan took Katherine back to the line shack where he had saved her life. It was summer now, the mountains green and alive, nothing like the frozen wasteland it had been that terrible winter. They stood outside the small cabin, holding hands, looking at the place where their story had truly begun. "You ever think about that day?" Katherine asked. "About how close I came to dying." "Every day," Duncan said quietly. "And every day I am grateful I found you, that I felt your heartbeat and refused to let you go." "My stubborn cowboy," Katherine said affectionately. "You saved my life that day, Duncan, but you did more than that. You gave me a reason to live, a future to fight for. You gave me love and family and a happiness I never thought possible." "You gave me the same," Duncan replied. "Before I found you, I was just existing, working my ranch, building something without really knowing why. You gave my life meaning, gave me someone to build a future with." They kissed, a long, sweet kiss that held all the love and passion of a decade together. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine rested her head on Duncan's shoulder, looking out at the mountains that had almost killed her, but had also brought her the greatest love of her life. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of family life. James married a rancher's daughter from Lincoln and brought her home to help run the growing operation. Sarah, to everyone's surprise, went to school in Santa Fe and became a teacher, though she always came home for summers to help with roundup. Thomas, true to his childhood dreams, became a deputy sheriff and made his parents proud with his integrity and courage. Duncan and Katherine grew older together, their dark hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the land they loved. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences, by children raised and grandchildren welcomed, by hardships overcome and triumphs celebrated. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. James and his wife brought their 3 children. Sarah came with her husband, a shopkeeper from Fort Stanton. Thomas brought his new bride, a spirited girl who reminded Katherine of herself at that age. Tommy and his family were there too, along with Samuel Wright and his grown children, and what seemed like half of Lincoln County. As the party swirled around them, Duncan pulled Katherine aside and led her to the porch where he had proposed all those years ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted from inside the house. "I have been thinking," Duncan said, putting his arm around Katherine's waist. "About that day in the snow, about how different our lives might have been if I had not found you." "I would be dead," Katherine said simply, "and you would be alone. But I did find you, and you lived, and we built this amazing life together." Duncan gestured at the ranch, at the house full of family and friends, at the land they had nurtured for decades. "Sometimes I wonder if it was fate, if we were always meant to find each other." "I do not know about fate," Katherine said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "But I know that you refused to let me die that day. You found my heartbeat when I had almost given up, and you fought to keep it going. Everything we have, everything we are, started with that decision you made to save a stranger in the snow." "Best decision I ever made," Duncan said, kissing the top of her head. "I would do it again in a heartbeat." "I know you would," Katherine said softly. "That is who you are, Duncan Wade, a man who does not give up, who fights for what is right, who loves with his whole heart. I have been blessed every single day since you found me." They stood together on the porch as the sun sank behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside, their children and grandchildren laughed and celebrated, the house filled with warmth and light and love. The ranch that had nearly been lost to thieves and death now thrived across thousands of acres, a testament to hard work and determination, and the partnership between a cowboy and the woman he had refused to let die. Duncan thought about that day 25 years ago, about finding Katherine in the snow, about feeling that faint heartbeat beneath his fingers. He thought about the risk he had taken, carrying her through the storm, fighting to save her life. And he thought about everything that had come from that decision: love and family, joy and sorrow, a life rich with meaning and purpose. "Thank you," Katherine whispered, as if reading his thoughts. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for fighting to live," Duncan replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a stubborn cowboy. Thank you for being my partner in everything." They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, a kiss that held decades of love and devotion. Inside, someone called for them to come dance, and they went together, hand in hand, into the warmth and light of their home, into the embrace of their family, into the life they had built together against all odds. And if sometimes Duncan still woke in the night and reached for Katherine, needing to feel her heartbeat strong and steady beneath his palm, needing the reassurance that she was real and alive, and his, well, Katherine understood. She would take his hand and press it to her chest, letting him feel the rhythm of her heart, that stubborn beat that had refused to quit on a frozen mountain so long ago. "Still here," she would whisper. "Still beating, still yours." "Forever," Duncan would reply. "Always and forever." And in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the life and love they had created, they would drift back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other something precious and rare. A love that had been forged in snow and blood and determination. A love that had survived hardship and danger. A love that would endure until their last breaths and beyond. The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch passed to James, who ran it with the same integrity and skill his parents had shown. Sarah's children came every summer, filling the house with youthful energy. Thomas rose through the ranks to become sheriff of Lincoln County, respected and admired by everyone who knew him. Duncan and Katherine grew old together, their steps slower but their love as strong as ever. They spent their days on the porch, watching the land they had built together, telling stories to their grandchildren about the old days, about the Wild West that was slowly being tamed. On a crisp autumn day in 1904, Duncan woke to find Katherine struggling to breathe. He sent for the doctor, but both of them knew what was coming. Katherine was 70 years old, and her heart, that stubborn heart that had beaten against all odds for so long, was finally wearing out. The family gathered, filling the house with quiet grief. Duncan sat beside Katherine's bed, holding her hand, unwilling to leave her side for even a moment. Their children stood nearby, tears streaming down their faces, saying goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their family. "Do you remember," Katherine whispered, her voice weak but clear, "that day in the snow? Every detail," Duncan said, his own voice breaking. "I remember finding you, feeling your heartbeat, knowing I could not let you go." "You saved me that day," Katherine said. "You gave me 50 more years, Duncan. 50 years of love and family and happiness. I have no regrets." "I wish we had 50 more," Duncan said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "I wish I could save you again." "You did save me," Katherine said, squeezing his hand with what little strength remained. "You save me every day by loving me. I am not afraid, Duncan. I have lived a full life. I have loved and been loved. That is all anyone can ask for." "I love you," Duncan said. "I will love you until I draw my last breath." "And I love you," Katherine whispered. "Thank you for finding my heartbeat all those years ago. Thank you for refusing to let me die. Thank you for the most beautiful life any woman could ask for." She closed her eyes then, a peaceful expression on her face, and her breathing gradually slowed. Duncan held her hand, feeling her pulse grow fainter, feeling that heartbeat that had defined his life begin to fade. When it finally stopped, when Katherine drew her last breath and was still, Duncan bowed his head and wept. They buried Katherine on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Katherine Sullivan Wade, beloved wife, mother, and partner." Her heart beat against all odds. The funeral was the largest Fort Stanton had ever seen, with people coming from across the territory to pay their respects to a woman who had touched so many lives. Duncan lived for 3 more years, long enough to see his youngest grandchild married, long enough to know that the ranch would continue for generations. But part of him had died with Katherine, and everyone could see it. He still worked when he was able, still told stories to the great-grandchildren, still smiled when the family gathered. But there was a sadness in his eyes that never quite went away, a longing for the woman who had been his partner for 50 years. On a winter morning in 1907, James found his father sitting peacefully in his chair on the porch, looking out at the mountains. Duncan had passed quietly in the night, a slight smile on his face, one hand resting over his heart. They buried him beside Katherine on that same hill, and everyone who attended the funeral agreed that Duncan Wade had finally gone to join the woman he had saved and loved for so long. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the Wade family, each generation adding to the legacy that Duncan and Katherine had built. The story of how they met, how Duncan had found Katherine dying in the snow and refused to let her go, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of courage, determination, and true love. And sometimes, on winter mornings when the snow lay thick on the ground and the mountains gleamed white in the distance, ranch hands working the high country would swear they saw two figures riding together across the ridgeline, a man and a woman on horseback, their laughter carrying on the wind. They never came close enough to see clearly, always disappearing into the mist before anyone could get a good look. But those who knew the story smiled and said it was Duncan and Katherine, still riding together, still partners, their love transcending even death. The legend of the cowboy who refused to let a woman's heartbeat stop, who saved her from the snow and built a life with her that became the foundation of one of the most successful ranches in New Mexico, lived on long after everyone who had known them was gone. It became part of the history of Lincoln County, a story told to remind people that sometimes in the darkest moments when death seems certain and hope seems lost, one person's determination to save another can change everything. One heartbeat, refusing to quit. One cowboy, refusing to let it stop. And from that simple, stubborn act of courage, a love story for the ages was born.